Guardians. Today we're covering 5 hunter builds that are incredibly strong in Episode Heresy. These builds specialize at being the best in specific areas of the game. This could be creating a threadling army, having ungodly survivability, or even using your super for weapon surge? Let's jump right on into it. The first build on the list is a hunter build that focuses on maximizing your damage with glaive melees. Now I think most people immediately think of Triton Vice when they think of a glaive hunter build, and this is a decent option, but an even better option is the class exotic with Spirit of Synthoceps while you're on Prismatic. They both give 100% glaive melee damage while surrounded. The class exotic opens up more options for your build, and a classic being Spirit of Inmost Light for ability spam, or Spirit of Galnor if you want your super back quicker. But I also like Spirit of Synthoceps better because it buffs all of your melees, not just your glaive melee. That way we can bring the grapple grenade and threaded spike to deal a ton of damage while you're surrounded. And we pair that with 2 fragments, Facet of Dawn so that you become radiant when getting melee hits, and Facet of Blessing so that you begin health regeneration on melee kills. And yes, both of these do get procced from glaive melee kills. You have flexibility with your super to match the situation that you're in, though I love bringing Tether for ad dense environments and the Golden Gun for boss DPS environments. And both of these will pair perfectly with Facet of Purpose. That way we gain either a Void Overshield or 5 seconds of restoration when we pick up an orb. And of course we're bringing Facet of Protection for that extra 15% damage resistance when we're surrounded, since this is a melee based build. And what's the flow for this build? Well, you want to get up in the action. That way you can proc all of your surrounded benefits. One of the best ways to do that is to get a kill with your Threaded Spike to proc Stylus Executioner. Then jump right into the mix and start spamming those glaive melees. If you start to get low on health or realize you're in a bad situation, you can grapple out or get a kill on a debuff target to go invisible. And when it comes to improving the build, for stats I shoot for 100 in resilience and 50 in mobility. Then I pour the rest of my stats into strength and discipline, with discipline being a higher priority. As for weapons, I love bringing the Stasis Glaive Rake Angle. That way I can bring a strong Void primary weapon with Repulsor Brace, and that also opens up your heavy slot to bring any DPS weapon that you want, though you could opt for a glaive in the energy slot, especially one that has the perk close to melee. That way you can amp up your glaive melee damage even further. But of course Winterbite is the strongest glaive if you do want to bring that. For the artifact, we do have a couple we want to bring. Nobel is the most important perk. Now glaive melee kills will provide ammo to special ammo glaives, and when we block damage with shields, we gain 85% more glaive melee damage for 6 seconds. Then I like to bring Hold the Line. Now while surrounded, kills will provide a bump in health and some extra reload speed. After that, you want to bring perks that match your weapons. For fusion rifles, make sure to bring Particle Reconstruction, and if you plan on bringing void weapons, Volatile Marksman and Maligned Harvest are both really good. This build is incredibly fun this season with all the glaive perks that we have, so be sure to give it a shot before these perks are gone. The next build on the list is honestly one of, if not the strongest hunter build right now, and that's because we're bringing the exotic chest Gifted Conviction. With this exotic, whenever you apply Jolt, you gain stacking damage resistance. On your 3rd time applying Jolt, you'll reach the cap of resist times 4, or in other words, 50% damage resistance. It becomes incredibly easy to jolt enemies when you bring the aspect Ascension. Now, while in the air, you can enter helicopter mode, which will make you amplified, damage nearby enemies, and also jolt them. So we aim to get our class ability back incredibly quickly. That way we can constantly jolt enemies to keep up our resist times 4. In easy content, I love bringing Threaded Spectre, since you will create a decoy every time you go into helicopter mode. However, in hard content, Stylus Executioner is definitely better for staying alive. Since we will be amplified nearly constantly, we can bring Facet of Hope. That way we can gain 60% increased class ability regeneration whenever we have a buff active. And to make up the difference, I also like to bring Focusing Strike, Bolstering Detonation, and Utility Kickstarter. That way whenever we use any of our abilities, we gain back more class ability energy. And I love bringing Facet of Purpose. That way we can gain restoration every time we pick up an orb. And you can then bring Facet of Protection, so that you take 15% less damage while you're surrounded. And we can take this one step further by bringing Threaded Spike, which will sever targets that it hits so that they deal even less damage to you. And top it all off with the Grapple Grenade, so you have a ton of movement and you can easily get out of some really sticky situations. And what's the flow for this build? Well, spam your Ascension. Pretty simple, but honestly it's the most important thing, since when you hit an enemy with Ascension, you gain those damage resistance stacks. You can then use your other abilities to rapidly gain back that class ability energy. And don't forget that with Facet of Dawn, every time we use our grenade and powered melee, we become radiant for extra weapon damage. And when it comes to improving the build, for stats I shoot for 100 in resilience and I go for about 50 in mobility. Then I pour the rest of my stats into discipline and strength, with discipline being the higher priority. As for the the weapons, you have a ton of flexibility. Weapons with Volt Shot make it easier to keep up that damage resistance. However, I love bringing a strong ad clearing weapon with Repulsor Brace, like the Velocity Baton. That way, I have another way to gain health and damage resistance. And for the artifact, you have a bunch of perks that synergize well with this build. Dielectric will give you more bolt charge stacks for killing those jolted targets. But Photonic Flare is also really strong, since enemies that are jolted and killed by arc damage will create a blinding burst. But I love to bring a Void weapon and then pair that with Volatile Marksman and Maligned Harvest. Now rapid precision hits or kills with Void weapons will give volatile rounds, and class ability energy when boosted. And rapidly inflicting volatile will create a weakening burst on your next Void damage instance. Otherwise, you want to match your artifact perks to the weapons that you bring. This build is insanely strong in any content because of how easy it is to keep up your damage resistance. If you're looking for a Grandmaster or Dungeon build, then this is the one. And if you're looking for a channel that covers all sorts of Destiny 2 builds, then make sure to subscribe. Alright, let's get back to the video. And contrary to our last build, this next build is stupid. It's goofy, and somehow it's still kind of strong? Okay, I wanted to make an Arc Hunter build that focuses on getting as much bolt charge as possible. When running through all the options I had available, I saw the exotic Blight Ranger. Now, I haven't used this exotic in a long time. Heck, I actually don't know if I ever even used it in the first place. But I did see two advantages that it gives you. First, when we deactivate our Arc Staff super, we gain some super energy. It triggers an AoE burst around us, and more importantly, we gain 21 seconds of ×4 arc weapon surge, which is technically more than you can get with armor mods, so it does open up your leg mods to use whatever you want. And second, while blocking with your arc staff super, it no longer costs energy. Reflected projectiles give back super energy, and they'll deal a whopping 400% more damage. This sounded fantastic, but it ended up being irrelevant. See, I thought this would be big damage, but honestly, it still just tickles enemies. So I started to count this build out until I realized since we can pop our super and immediately deactivate it to gain the most weapon surge possible, plus we retain 75% of our super, we can then use that as a catalyst to gain our weapon surge. And since we gain 21 seconds of that weapon surge, we still have our weapon surge active by the time we get our super back, as long as we keep dealing damage. So the whole idea for the build is to use your super for AoE damage and maximum weapon damage, and nothing else. That means anytime you start an encounter, you find the nearest group of enemies, pop your super, and immediately deactivate it near them. This causes that AoE burst, and it gives you that arc weapon surge, so start going to town with your arc weapons. Continue to pop your super and deactivate it whenever you get low on weapon surge, or you want to deal some burst AoE damage. And if you want to deal some extra AoE damage, you can also continuously spam your Ascension. But I also love to bring Disorienting Blast so that I can gain more bolt charge and I can blind a ton of enemies in front of me. But this is also huge for DPS phases, since you can easily pop and then deactivate your super whenever you want so that you can keep up that arc weapon damage. And since we will constantly have that super available, this also means that if your teammates go down or are just in a weird res spot, you can pop your super and just hold that block button to safely res them. And when it comes to improving the build, for stats, I shoot for 100 in Resilience and Discipline. And then I like to make sure I have at least 50 mobility. As for weapons, I love to bring a strong arc heavy weapon like Thunderlord or Queenbreaker. And then I make sure to also bring a strong arc primary weapon. And if you have the exotic slot available, Risk Runner is also a ton of fun, giving you more damage resistance to arc damage and some more ad clearing potential. As for that artifact, make sure to bring Flashover for more bolt charge damage and Defibrillating Blast to gain health on bolt charge damage. But Dielectric is also great for gaining more stacks of bolt charge by defeating arc debuffed enemies. And Photonic Flare is also really strong at spreading that blind to a ton of enemies just by killing jolted enemies with arc damage. What I love most about this build is the ability to embrace the fun and goofiness video games have to offer. And this season, it's actually somehow pretty strong. But I don't see this build being anything more than another way to enjoy the video game that we all love. This season, Threadlings are strong, and with Act 2 right around the corner, they're about to become even stronger, and that's why I wanted to make a Threadling army build for Hunters. So we landed back on Strand. That way we can bring Thread of Evolution and have our Threadlings deal 33% more damage. And one of the main ways we will be creating Threadlings comes from our exotic and an aspect. We're bringing Radiant Dance Machines paired with Threaded Spectre. That way we can dodge up to 3 times, creating decoys that when destroyed will spawn 2 Threadlings each. But this also makes it so that getting primary weapon kills will grant class ability energy. That way you can keep spamming those decoys. And that's why I'm bringing a strong Strand primary weapon paired with the fragment Thread of Rebirth. Now Strand weapon kills will progress a counter and eventually create a Threadling. Then I like to pair this with the aspect Whirling Maelstrom. That way we can throw or destroy a Tangle to create a spinning Beyblade that will deal damage and unravel enemies. And now that everything's unraveled, Horde Shuttle will kick in, creating Threadlings by dealing damage on all of those unraveled enemies. Our decoys that we create will distract enemies so that we take less damage, but I like to amp up our survivability even further by bringing Thread of Warding paired with Recuperation. That way, every time we pick up an orb, we gain Woven Mail for more damage resistance and a bump of health. And what's the flow for this build? Well, it's honestly so simple. Slay out with your primary weapon, and anytime you want to mass create Threadlings, or you just need some safety, spam your dodge to create a ton of decoys. When we get the ability to boost Horde Shuttle so that Threadlings will also sever enemies, this build is going to be so much stronger than it already is. When it comes to improving the build, for stats, I shoot for 100 in Resilience and Discipline. Then I like to make sure I have at least 50 mobility, and I pour the rest into my strength. As for weapons, you can bring a Strand primary weapon with Hatchling to create even more Threadlings. However, I was having a ton of fun with the new Barrow Dyad, which will also become even stronger when we get more of its intrinsic traits. As for the artifact, the only perk that you really need is Horde Shuttle. That way you can create even more Threadlings. But Unraveling Orbs is also really nice. That way you can make sure every enemy is unraveled, but it's honestly a bit overkill. Otherwise, match your artifact perks to the weapons that you bring. Threadling builds are honestly some of the most fun to use, and they tend to be some of the best ad clearing builds around. You definitely got to give this one a shot. For the last build, I wanted to make a build that focused around using the new Hunter aspect on the prowl. And this makes it so that whenever you go invisible, a new enemy is marked as a priority target. Whenever you or your team kills that enemy, they release a weakening smoke cloud that gives grenade, melee, and class ability energy. This cloud deals damage over time, but it also allows you and allies to go invisible when passing through it. And this is such a unique gameplay loop when compared to how most other builds work. Now you want to be a bit more intentional with which enemies you're killing, going for those priority targets more often. The really cool thing is that these smoke clouds that drop from killing priority targets offer a ton of benefit, but they also count as melee damage, meaning it can proc other aspects, fragments, and even armor mods. And since we can easily keep up our invisibility and make our allies invisible, it only seemed right to bring the exotic chest piece Omnioculus. That way, whenever you or your allies are invisible, you gain ×4 resist, or an extra 50% damage resistance. Plus, we get an extra smoke bomb, and whenever we make an ally invisible, we gain back 50% melee energy. And yes, this does work with the smoke clouds that drop from on the prowl. So what does this look like in action? Well, at the start of every encounter, I like to activate my quick fall near teammates to go invisible and refund my melee energy. That will mark a target, so I make sure to try and prioritize that enemy, and once killed, I quickly jump into the cloud of smoke. Repeat this cycle as much as you want to gain back more ability energy and constantly weaken enemies. If you get caught in a sticky situation, quickly activate your quick fall to go invisible and gain that damage resistance. If you have a tougher target that needs melting, feel free to chuck a normal smoke grenade at them. That way you can weaken them and deal some extra damage. And when it comes to improving the build, for stats, I shoot for 100 in Resilience and Discipline, and after that I go for a mix of mobility and strength. As for weapons, I love bringing a strong Void primary weapon. Le Monarch honestly feels really good. Its poison damage paired with the smoke cloud damage slowly ticks away at enemies, but its catalyst also offers you Unrelenting for more healing, and you can easily pair that with a strong Void heavy weapon such as a machine gun like Hammerhead, which can get some really good damage perks. As for the artifact, we want to bring Volatile Marksman. That way rapid Void weapon kills or precision hits will give you volatile rounds. Then we can bring Maligned Harvest, so that after rapidly inflicting volatile, you create a weakening burst on your next Void damage instance. Otherwise, any artifact perks that match your weapons are your best bet. The amount of invisibility you have for you and your team, plus the damage resistance, makes this a perfect build for hard content, especially content where you have to interact with a ton of things or want to skip hard sections. And there you have it, Guardians. We've covered builds that are goofy, builds that make the most out of the artifact, and even builds that keep you alive. But if you want to see 5 Warlock builds for Episode Heresy, then go check out this video here. Remember, mastering these builds is only the beginning. Experiment with different combinations and tweak your loadouts to suit your playstyle. If you found this video helpful or just enjoyed seeing a new perspective, feel free to like the video and comment down below on what builds you've been enjoying most for Hunters. Keep an eye out for future videos as we continue to explore the ever-evolving world of Destiny 2. Until then, may the threads of fate be ever in your favor. This is Lucky Mech, signing off. See you on the next adventure, Guardians.